This amendment does a couple different things. It would fund 20 days of extended learning for students who are below in English and math. It also provides $50 million in grants for tutoring and additional funding for special education. I was working with OSPI during an earlier part of the session and realized there was tutoring that was funded in our last budget, but only $2 million worth, so that was exhausted very rapidly. And so I thought it was important that we focus on tutoring in response to learning loss that happened due to COVID. I want to make sure that every single student has the opportunity to be successful in our K-12 system, and that requires us to be responsive to the pandemic and the learning loss associated with it. I think providing additional time and one-on-one opportunities is invaluable. So that's why we're going with the 20 additional days and specifically dedicating funds to tutoring. So asking for a yes on the amendment.
1981 was a pretty momentous year, I think. I Googled it to find out what the most popular song was in 1981. Don't think I've ever heard it. What the most popular movie in 1981 was. I've heard of it, but I haven't seen it. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, I was not alive in 1981, so I don't actually have a lot of insight into 1981. I know the gray hair kind of belies that a little bit. But 1981 does stand out for one really important reason, Mr. Speaker, and that is that 1981 saw higher inflation in this country than any other year in my lifetime until this past year. This past year, Mr. Speaker, inflation soared to over 9%. We've already heard a couple ways how Washington is unaffordable on this House floor just while debating the budget. We've heard how expensive college can be. We've heard how expensive housing can be, and that's all true. But imagine, Mr. Speaker, if you don't have enough money to know where you're going to live next month, if you don't have enough money to even begin to dream about sending your kids to college. Mr. Speaker, too many of Washington's working families find themselves in this situation, and that's why a couple years ago I worked so hard to make sure that this body fully funded the state's working families tax credit for the first time in that program's history. The amendment before us, Mr. Speaker, would continue on that success and provide $500 payments to every single family eligible for the working families tax credit in fiscal years 2024 and fiscal years 2025. Mr. Speaker, as I said, Washington and the country are very unaffordable with inflation as high as it is. And this program, the Working Families Tax Credit, is a way to provide a sales tax rebate to those families who need that money the most. Working Families Tax Credit is a very proven solution. It is a win for everybody. It is a win for the taxpayers who get more of their tax money back into their pocket. It's a win for families who get to decide the best way to use that money rather than being told by a state agency or government bureaucrat what specific uses they can use their state assistance for. Mr. Speaker, one of my regrets about the underlying budget is that there's no broad-based tax relief for the people of Washington. And unfortunately, it's kind of hard to amend a budget to do that without amending substantive law. But luckily, the Working Families Tax Credit is structured a little bit differently. And we can have a vote right here, Mr. Speaker, to provide the closest thing to broad-based tax relief that we can provide in this particular budget document. Mr. Speaker, Washington is unfortunately becoming an outlier this decade in terms of states that have not provided broad-based tax relief to the people that they represent. In New York State, they cut the state income tax. In Illinois, they provided rebates or tax rebates to individuals earning as much as $400,000. In California, they provided tax rebates to individuals earning as much as $500,000. And right now in Massachusetts, the Democratic governor has proposed a $700 million tax cut. And in the next couple of days, the Massachusetts Speaker of the House is going to propose his own series of tax cuts. So, Mr. Speaker, large state after large state around the country, from Massachusetts to California, from New York to Illinois, have found it within their state budgets to provide broad-based tax relief. Here in Washington State, our budget has grown from $34 billion to now $69 billion in the 8 years I've served in this chamber. Surely, with that 100% increase, a $35 billion growth of state revenue and state spending, we can find it within ourselves to provide some modicum of tax relief for the people we represent. Illinois, New York, California, Massachusetts all found a way to do it, and with inflation higher than it's ever been in my entire lifetime, higher than at any point since 1981. We owe it to the people we represent to do that, and we have a great opportunity before us by funding the Working Families Tax Credit even more than it's been funded in the past, by providing $500 tax rebates to eligible families this year and next year. Please vote yes, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope you'll join me in voting yes on this amendment that provides some fiscal stability for our future. What this amendment would do is return and add some much-needed monies to our Budget Stabilization Account. Why is that important? Well, Mr. Speaker, you and I weren't here during the last Great Recession, but I've heard stories, and no doubt you've heard stories about what a difficult time that was for this body and, more importantly, for the state. The BSA was created to ensure that in the event of another recession or something similar, we would have the ability to fund core programs without drastic cuts to state budgets. This amendment does that by returning $1 billion to the BSA that was taken out over the last few years that needs to be there. Additionally, it funds the additional $500 million that normally would have been moved under current law. Why is this important? Well, we've got dark storm clouds approaching in our state and in our country. We've been on a huge revenue increase over the past number of years, and I think, unfortunately, those glory days are coming to an end. I think we're going to start seeing more challenges to our underlying revenues, and unfortunately, it's going to force us to make some difficult decisions. The BSA is designed so that we can do our job without drastic cuts. This amendment is funded not with any cuts to underlying programs, but by reallocating new monies that were in this current budget back to our BSA. The people of the state of Washington expect us to be good financial stewards of their money. This amendment does that. And I'll tell you what, if we don't fund this and we have trouble in the future, it's going to be much longer conversations on this House floor, and it's going to be a much rougher conversation about how we fund our state priorities. Our state treasurer, Mr. Speaker, has urged us to meet a 10% minimum. And over this 4-year outlook, we are going to fall woefully short of that, well below state average here locally and well below states across this country. Again, this budget amendment is fiscally responsible. We are not cutting programs. We are simply allocating new monies in this underlying budget to restoring our BSA, which we can all agree on is going to be is needed, is responsible, and protects Washington's future in uncertain economic forecasts. Please vote yes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment would eliminate the repayment to the general fund for trust program startup costs that are dedicated to the trust account for the long-term care payroll tax program. It also assumes that the program would be repealed with House Bill 1011, which is still alive today, and hopefully we get an opportunity to vote for it. This long-term care trust program is unpopular. 63% of our constituents voted against the establishment of a long-term care payroll tax program. And in the past year, we've had 475,000 plus workers throughout the state of Washington opting out of this program. It is very unpopular, and this amendment would help to make the general fund right by, again, eliminating the repayment to the general fund from that dedicated account by assuming that the program would be repealed and that the payroll tax would not be collected. In addition to it not being popular, the program itself is just unfair. It's an aggressive tax on working individuals throughout the state of Washington who are W-2 employees, regardless of their ability to pay the tax. If you're a family of 2 or 3 or 4 making $60,000, you're going to be paying $350 a year, $35 a month or $30 a month on this program, with maybe never the possibility of ever using it. If you're close to retirement, you'll never use this program. If your spouse needs long-term care, maybe they were a stay-at-home spouse and you worked, that income, which traditionally would be a community asset, goes into a program that they can never use because you can't transfer those long-term care services. If you're going to retire out of state, you'll never use those services, and many will end up contributing more to the program than they'll ever get out of it in benefits. And that's why this amendment would assume House Bill 1011 would repeal the long-term care program, as well as eliminate that transfer to the general fund and make it solvent. The other issue, in addition to it being unfair and unpopular, is it's just inadequate. The program itself provides a benefit that many testified would only provide several months worth of care. It's very far from long-term care. It's actually short-term. And it gives the false sense to so many workers and families in our state that their long-term care needs will be taken care of through this program. And for many, they'll never get that opportunity to opt out. So it's my hope that we will pass this amendment. It's also my hope that we can repeal the long-term care program. There are a lot of folks in our communities that are struggling. And for some, $30 or $40 a month isn't a lot. But for so many in my community, that's a lot of money. And as the good gentleman in the 31st had mentioned about the inflation rate being higher than it was in 1981, well, I've got news for the good member from the 31st. Betty Davis' Eyes, I think, was the #1 song in 1981. And Raiders of the Lost Ark was the best movie. So I do hope that we pass this. I hope that we set the general fund straight and that we repeal the long-term care payroll tax program.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this amendment deals with public safety and making this a higher priority as we move this bill out of this body today. First of all, it deals with recruiting and retention bonuses for our law enforcement professionals. Since 2020, we have literally lost hundreds of law enforcement officers who have left the state or retired. And I don't think I've been a member of this body very often, going in my 5th year here, but we went from being 48th in the nation in our per capita law enforcement staffing to last. And it's interesting to me because I hear themes all the time that, Washington is leading the way. Washington is #1 in this and that and all these other things. But do we want to be last in public safety? I don't think the people across Washington state want to live in an unsafe state. So this puts additional funding, $126 million into funding recruitment and retention bonuses for law enforcement professionals. It also spends $25 million funding body cameras. And that goes out in the form of grants to law enforcement agencies across the state. We've heard over and over again the benefits of a transparent public safety system where our officers have body cameras on them to record their jobs and keep everybody on each side of the camera safe. The bill also puts $10 million into the auto theft prevention fund. This is an account in which is divided up regionally so law enforcement can do those complex investigations. And I think this is a priority to the people of Washington state because we've had a record number of auto thefts, over 50,000 vehicles stolen in the last year. To those 50,000 Washington residents, they want somebody investigating that crime. They want somebody to find out where their vehicle went and to return that to them so that they can get to work, earn a living, and this should be a priority in the state's budget. I urge adoption.
Starting the 1st of this year, the Climate Commitment Act policy went into place. The refineries estimated what the fees that they would have to buy credits for. They made an estimate, and then those fees got passed on to the growers. One thing about reading the law, it is very clear agriculture and the farmers are exempt from paying those. The second thing that's very clear is the farmers have had to pay them. And they've been paying those fees for the emission credits since the beginning of the year. This amendment would allow for the year until we get a system put in place to take care of this problem, would allow the farmers to be able to turn in their receipts and get reimbursed for that. Madam Speaker, here the opportunity tonight for us to follow the law. And frankly, if we aren't going to follow the law, why are we even here?
I'd like to join the gentlewoman from the 33rd District in thanking both herself and everyone else she mentioned, the gentleman from the 3rd, the good and gracious chair of the Appropriations Committee, the gentleman from the 11th, and the gentleman from the 43rd, who along with the gentlewoman from the 43rd, who along with the gentlewoman from the 33rd, all serve as vice chairs of the Appropriations Committee. And would also like to thank the partisan and nonpartisan staff who helped put this 1,400-page budget together. I have been exposed to a very tiny sliver of all of the work they do. I am in some, but not nearly all of the meetings they are. It takes a tremendous amount of work to put together a $70 billion budget that funds the state's needs and priorities. And as much as we disagree on what exactly the scope of those needs are and how we order those priorities, the fact of the matter is it is a substantively daunting task that they undertook. They got far less sleep than you did, Madam Speaker, far less sleep than I did. And the entire state owes them a debt of gratitude for their dedication to the job. I also want to thank that team led by the gentleman from the 3rd District for his willingness to hear out suggestions and requests for provisos and other funding items in the budget. He had a pretty open door to both me and my colleagues in this caucus. He had a process whereby we could, request and argue for things that were important for our districts, and I really do appreciate that. But in spite of that, Madam Speaker, I'm urging a no vote tonight, and it's not because we were unable to present our ideas, but to give you a sense of the scale of how big the budget is and where Republican ideas play into that. There are around 1,500 individual policy-level additions in this budget. About 50 of them came at the suggestion or request of House Republicans. And don't get me wrong, I'm very grateful that those 50 items are scattered throughout this budget. A few of them were requested by me, a few of them were requested by, or the others were requested by my colleagues here on this side of the aisle, and none of us would have sought that funding or sought that proviso language if we did not think it was something that was critically important for the communities we represent and the state that we serve. And so I'm glad that those provisos and those suggestions were included in this budget. But, Madam Speaker, 50 out of 1,500 is about 3%. We represent about 40% of Washington residents. We represent about 3 million people on this side of the aisle. And to say that we only get to suggest 50 out of the 1,500 policy-level additions in the budget, I think is insufficient. I don't think that is the kind of inclusion that we would like to see over here on this side of the aisle. You heard a number of amendments tonight, Madam Speaker, and many of which were not adopted. And in remarks explaining why they should not be adopted, members on the other side of the aisle noted that the amendments would have us pit one program against the other. But, Madam Speaker, that is an unfortunate necessity of the fact that Republicans were not included in the room where these decisions were made. Because of our really strong balanced budget requirement in Washington state, Republicans can't simply suggest that we should spend more on something without sending our budget out of balance. So instead, we need to suggest if we want to increase funding in an area, we need to identify where funding should be decreased. And that's not easy, and it certainly doesn't make you popular. Trust me, Madam Speaker, it is not nearly as much fun to be the caucus that says we are spending too much money. However, Madam Speaker, had Republicans been allowed in the room, so to speak, I think that a lot of these discussions could have happened in a more productive manner. And rather than pitting one program against the other, we could have had robust debates, like I had with the gentlewoman from the 48th, about the degree to which we are funding Evergreen State College versus the degree to which we want to fund low-income high school kids taking dual credit courses. And there could have been some give and take, and we could have found a happy medium. But unfortunately, Madam Speaker, when Republicans aren't included in the process, we have no choice but to point out in stark contrast where our priorities are, and you saw that tonight. But I think there could have been a better way where we could have had much more of a dialogue and much more of a give and take. And Madam Speaker, I noted a second ago on my brief remarks on the striking amendment to the bill that is now before us that I recommended a no vote because I felt like the underlying bill that has now been amended by the striking amendment was better. Madam Speaker, when this bill that's before us came over from the body across the rotunda, it came on a very strong bipartisan vote. It came on a 40-9 vote. Over half of the minority caucus in the body across the rotunda voted for this bill when it was before them. Madam Speaker, they were allowed in the room. They had substantive role in negotiating what was included and what was not included in that budget. And it led to over half of that minority caucus voting for this budget. But unfortunately, Madam Speaker, because my caucus was not involved, I'm recommending a no vote on this budget. Madam Speaker, we have a lot of concerns about the substance in the budget that I think could have been addressed had there been a more inclusive process. As I mentioned a minute ago, I got elected in 2014. At that point in time, the state budget spent about $33.7 billion. The budget that is now before us on the floor will spend $69.6 billion. That represents a doubling of state spending in about 8 or 9 years. I don't think my family's household income has doubled in 8 or 9 years. I certainly don't think many of the constituents I represent have seen their own budgets double in the last 8 or 9 years. I don't know very many small businesses who have seen their revenue double in the last 8 or 9 years, but state spending will have now doubled with the passage of this budget. Also, Madam Speaker, a minute ago I mentioned the state treasurer, and I really appreciate the job he's doing. It's a hard job, and our state's bond ratings are very good, thanks to leadership in that office from Republicans previously and Democrats currently. Madam Speaker, we received a letter from the state treasurer a few days ago suggesting that the budget ensure that we leave 10% of the general fund as reserves. But the budget that is now before us misses that mark. Before it was amended, it did meet that mark. But as it has now been amended, our reserves are at 6.8%, far short of the 10% the treasurer recommends. And lastly, Madam Speaker, in terms of its sustainability, by funding so many different items, 1,500 items by my count, it left less money able to be devoted towards the state's most urgent and pressing priorities. And that is another reason why I'm recommending a no vote, Madam Speaker. The state has been blessed by a number of very successful companies and individuals, and our tax revenues have grown very quickly, and that is why we've been able to pass budgets that will now be doubling in a period of 8 or 9 years. But despite all of this new revenue, Madam Speaker, I think this budget fails to address the state's most urgent and pressing priorities. You heard a little bit about those priorities tonight. First and foremost, funding education is the state's paramount duty. We on this side of the aisle believe that that is what we should fund first before we address anything else. That's not to say those other things aren't important. There are, of course, many other important things that are funded in the state budget, but none of them are the state's paramount duty under its Constitution to fund. K-12 education is. And so we had amendments to increase funding for special education, to address the severe amount of learning loss that our kids suffered when their schools were closed or conducted remotely during the pandemic. And it would have ensured that high school kids in dual credit classes that were low income had those course fees covered. So, Madam Speaker, by spending money in so many other areas, we have neglected to meet our constitutional duty to fully fund education. That should have been funded first, not alongside and as part of everything else included in this budget. Madam Speaker, we also believe on this side of the aisle that we need safe communities, and a number of our amendments would have helped us achieve that goal. We had a chance to provide funding to help clean up encampments. And as the gentleman from the 35th District mentioned, our own governor just said just this last week that these encampments are a scourge on our state and they need to be cleaned up. We had funding available for cities to do that, and unfortunately, that amendment was rejected. We also face a tremendous shortage of qualified police officers, and so an amendment from the gentlewoman from the 25th District to provide recruitment and retention bonuses for law enforcement officers to refill their depleted ranks. And lastly, Madam Speaker, we want to make Washington a more affordable place to live and work and grow a family. And most disappointingly in that regard, Madam Speaker, we had a chance to increase funding for the Working Families Tax Credit to provide some of that relief to make Washington more affordable. Unfortunately, that is not included in this budget. So, Madam Speaker, I'm recommending a no vote. I think a better result could have happened had there been a more inclusive process, and I hope with about 20 or something days left in session that can happen. But in the meantime, please vote no.